Storyteller's Thread, a monthly podcast devoted to young adult literature and the art of storytelling. I'm your host, Sean Connors. On each episode, we invite an author for young adults to take us inside their work, and in doing so, to talk about their writing process, their inspiration for writing for young readers, and the general ins and outs of earning a living as a professional storyteller. So, whether you're a compulsive reader, an aspiring writer, a teacher or librarian, or simply a frustrated reader who's counting the hours until you get home and dive back into that novel that's waiting for you on your nightstand, this is the place for you. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Storyteller's Thread podcast. It's December 1st, 2018, and the holiday season is fully upon us. I can only say that I hope it's warmer where you are than it's been where I am. It's been absolutely freezing these past few days. This month I'm talking with Sherri L. Smith, a powerful voice in the field of young adult literature and one of my favorite writers. Sherri's written several award-winning books for children and young adults, including Flygirl, Orleans, and Pasadena, just to name a few. And when she consented to appear as a guest on this program, I was beyond elated. If you aren't familiar with Sherri's work, I promise you're going to want to add her books to your holiday wish list by the time you finish listening to this episode. Before we hear from Sherri, I want to thank those of you who've been tuning into this podcast over the past few months. I truly appreciate your support. If this is your first time listening to the show and you like what you hear, please take a minute to rate it on iTunes. Alternatively, you can tell a friend about it or share the word on social media. Slowly but surely, we are building an audience for the program, and I couldn't do it without the support of listeners like you. As we prepare to enter the new year, I have plans to talk with many more writers for young adults whose work I know you'll recognize, and I hope you'll continue to accompany me on this journey. Thanks as always for listening to the program, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Sherri L. Smith on this month's episode of The Storyteller's Thread. Born in Chicago, Illinois, Sherri L. Smith is the author of multiple award-winning books for young readers that cross a range of genres. In 2003, the American Library Association named Smith's debut novel, Lucy the Giant, a best book for young people. Set during World War II, her novel Flygirl is the story of a light-skinned black girl who passes as white in order to fly airplanes for the Women's Air Force service pilots. Named a Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post, the novel explores the ways in which race and gender intersect to amplify oppression. Critics have praised Smith's fifth novel, Orleans, a work of speculative fiction, for its thoughtful representation of a strong female protagonist who is also a person of color. Inspired by the aftermath of the real-life Hurricane Katrina, the novel imagines a future in which the people of the Gulf Coast region, having been abandoned by the federal government, divide along medical rather than racial or gender lines. After publishing Pasadena, a work of noir fiction, in 2016, Smith wrote Who Were the Tuskegee Airmen?, a work of nonfiction that was published just this past year. As she awaits the publication of her first graphic novel, Pearl, also set during World War II, Smith is currently at work writing a comic book adaptation of James Cameron's blockbuster film, Avatar, which Dark Horse Comics will release in January 2019. When she isn't writing, Smith is likely to be found teaching writing, as she serves on the faculty of Goddard College's MFA in Creative Writing program, as well as Hamline University's MFA in Children's Writing program. Despite her busy work schedule, Smith, who currently lives in Los Angeles, graciously made time to sit down with me to talk about the path that she's traveled to write for young adults, one that has included stops for her in film, animation, comics, and even construction. In the course of our conversation, we explored a range of topics, including Smith's interest in mining stories from the World War II era, her inspiration for writing books that focus on characters who find strength in their relationships with other people, and her belief that honoring diversity in young adult literature entails more than simply featuring more racially or ethnically diverse characters in books for young readers. So you were born in Chicago, but your family moved often when you were a child, with stops in, I believe, Staten Island and Washington, D.C., and upstate New York. How did you experience moving around as a child? Was that difficult for you?
I wouldn't call it difficult. I guess it's funny. I think it's normal when people are like, this is the house that my grandparents were born in, and we're still here. I find that to be very strange. I think maybe I was buffered from some of it because I was 8 months old when we moved from Chicago to Staten Island. So I have no memory of Chicago. And I have like one sort of creepy memory of Staten Island where apparently my favorite bottle was a clown. So I have an image of standing and, looking out from my crib and someone holding this clown bottle out to me. So my earliest real memory is when we moved to DC. I was 3, and I remember that because we went into the house and the realtor looked down at the floor. He said, "These floors are older than you." And I thought, older than 3? How is it possible? And I just remember that very clearly, like the first time my mind was blown. And then we moved upstate New York when my parents got divorced, and that was harder, but that was divorce related rather than move related because it was a town that we knew. We already had a place up there. And then moving back to Chicago because the place in upstate New York was a little town and not accommodating to us. My mom couldn't find a job. It was fine when we were weekenders, but not when we were townies. And so we moved back to Chicago, and that was an uphill climb. That was hard. My dad was not paying child support. He didn't have to. The court order is very much not what I have come to believe the whole alimony and divorce situation is in most places. It heavily favored him. My mom got us and all the worries associated with us. But, God bless her, she was an amazing woman, and she was an educator, and she just made sure that we stayed the course and got us through college and grad school. And, hard times, but she was heroic, and we all survived.
And you said in the past that you fell in love with reading and writing at an early age. Was that in any part due to the situations you were experiencing as a child, the difficulty of divorce?
I'm going to say no, primarily because my parents met when they were teachers, but my dad was a scientist. He was a chemist for the Department of Agriculture. My mom was an educator, and they were both readers. And so we grew up with reading and storytelling. And so I was into it from a very young age. I remember in first grade, my teacher catching me reading in class and snapping at me. And I came up with the answer that I was holding the book open with one page and I couldn't release it because I didn't want to drop the book. So I wasn't reading. I was just holding the book until I could take it out of my hand, and she believed me. So I know I was reading from from an early age. But I was reading, I found this book in my elementary school library it must have been 6th grade. And it was called The Gray King by Susan Cooper. And I devoured it. And then I realized that it was the 4th book in the Dark is Rising series. And my parents got divorced, and the school didn't have any more of those books. But my parents got divorced, and we moved to upstate New York, and my junior high school library had the other books. And so those books were my companion through that first year of awkwardness. New kid, new grade, new school, attached to a high school. So we were switching classes and I knew those books mattered to me. It's a fantastic series based in Welsh mythology that's been turned into a not good movie. But it wasn't until, maybe 10, 12 years ago, I'm living in Los Angeles. I am a grown married woman, and I'm a member of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and I get a pamphlet from them for their New York conference, and Susan Cooper is their keynote speaker. And my husband was like, "What's that?" And I looked up at him and burst into tears. And he was like, "Don't read it then." Like, what's wrong? And I was just like, "Oh, Susan Cooper's going to be there." And he's like, "Well, then it sounds like you have to go." And I was like, "Yeah, okay." So I did. I flew to New York and I brought my copy of, I can't remember if I brought The Gray King exactly or which copy I brought, but I flew out there and did the conference, and she spoke and was powerful and amazing. And I stood in this really long line to get my book signed. And I was a blithering idiot. I was just like, "Your books were with me." And so if you asked me at any other time if, like, were books important to you because of the moving and I would have been like, I don't know, whatever. But, I owe this woman something, and I really appreciated it.
I believe that both of your parents were storytellers or readers.
Yes, they were both. My dad was into science fiction, and my mom read a lot of nonfiction, but my mom also read kid stories, like fairy tales. And I was a huge, huge fairy tale reader, like the Andrew Lang fairy books. And we had there was like a Harvard collection, these beautiful leather-bound blue books of Arabian Nights. And I had like a junior version that had Peter Pan and The Wizard of Oz and all these things that I obsessed over when I was a kid. But that I would tie that directly to my parents.
And you eventually returned to Chicago with your mother and your older brother, I believe around the time you were 12.
Yes, that's about right.
And after graduating from high school, you moved again, but this time to New York City, where you studied film and broadcast journalism at New York University. What drew you to film?
What drew me to film was, it's funny because I wanted to be a doctor for so many years when I was a kid. I wanted to be a baby doctor. I wanted to be an obstetrician. And I still think about that sometimes. I'm like, well, maybe I could be a midwife or a doula, because there's something fascinating about birth to me. But by high school, I was a storyteller. I was writing short stories for the school literary magazine. And I decided that I really loved movies. My mom was also a huge movie buff. So we watched a lot of movies, we watched a lot of old movies at home. And I thought, I'm a storyteller, and that's just another way to tell a story. So I'd really like to do that. And I wanted to be a producer, a film producer. And my mother said, "I wish you'd keep up with your writing. Why don't you double major in journalism?" And so I got my double major in film and broadcast journalism.
I was going to ask you whether you initially saw yourself writing screenplays or if you envisioned another position for yourself in that industry. What interested you about producing?
I loved the idea of being the cook that brings all the ingredients together. I liked the idea of having the vision and finding the team to pull it together. This I will also blame on my father because, quite frankly, because he was a Star Trek fan. And I'm a Star Trek fan. I grew up with it. And the bridge crew of the Enterprise is still sort of my ideal group of companions. And so if I could have found a group of creatives who all wanted to create the same vision together, that to me would be nirvana.
So one thing I've learned in doing some research on you is that you can't talk to Sherri L. Smith without bringing up the myriad colorful jobs that you've held in the course of your lifetime.
Yes.
After college, you did enter the film industry and you worked on Tim Burton's film Mars Attacks. What were your responsibilities in that film? And was there anything that you took from that experience that benefited you as a writer later?
That was sort of a roundabout thing. I had moved to LA, and I had found out about this program called Project Involve through the Independent Feature Project West. And the idea was to get a group of 20 young women from diverse backgrounds and give them mentorships in film, and then they would all come together and make an independent film. And I applied, and they accepted me on as a producer. And then they shifted the ground under my feet a little bit because the person running the program decided she wanted the producer credit. So I became the production manager. And during that time, it was about a year, I had a mentorship at Columbia Pictures in the story development department, and I had briefer mentorship with a producer named Lori Parker. And so after the program was over, I was trying to make my own short film. And I went to Lori to see if she could help me. Give me money, help me raise money, help me with equipment, suggestions, whatever. And she said, I can't give you anything, but I can give you a job, which is a thing that mothers approve of. So I said yes. And I became the office manager for Tim Burton Productions, which was his new production company. She was running it, and they were making this movie, Mars Attacks. And during my time there, I got to meet the crew. And the Martians in Mars Attacks were originally going to be stop motion animated. And I love animation. I did animation projects in college, and I was a Saturday morning cartoon person all the way up until they stopped running cartoons on Saturday morning. And so I hit it off with them, and they lured me away to work on the film. And I had two jobs. I was the assistant to the animation supervisor, and I was, what was my other title? It was like assistant. I can never remember if it was assistant animation production coordinator or assistant to the animation production coordinator. It depends on who you asked. But one of my jobs was to keep track of our film. So we had this great animation director, Barry Purvis, came over from England. And, stop motion is frame by frame and takes a long time. And I would keep the camera logs. So I would say, okay, we've used 2,000 frames of film today. Here's your film again. You're starting on frame 2001. And so I would track that. I was building a database to hire animators and keep track of people and, all the sort of the nuts and bolts office background stuff that never shows up on screen. I was making this giant scheduling board called the Big Board that was like the length of a hallway. It was horrible. It was so hard to make because you had to get the lines straight. And I was using one of those chalk snap rope things. But before we could get it done, they shut down our production. There was creative differences between the animation director and Tim Burton. Our guy was very classical, and he made these aliens move in these beautiful, flowing, bird-like ways, and Tim wanted clunky B-movie. And so they secretly took our tests and sent them up to Industrial Light and Magic, where they converted them to CG, to computer-generated Martians, which was going to be quicker and easier and allow for more changes for them, because we would need to know a year in advance what an actor was going to be wearing if we had to do something animated with them. And this way they could change it, oh no, she's wearing purple instead, and change it instantly, or, relatively instantly. So we were suddenly all out of a job. Right before Thanksgiving, as a matter of fact. And what I learned from that experience is I loved the connectedness of the crew. Once again, our animation crew was like a family, and some people did get married out of that. But I also learned a great distrust of the powers that be. And the difficulty, which is something I'd learned in film school, the difficulty of finding a team you can count on. But the good part of that is my animation experience there helped me when I applied for a job at Disney in story development. So not the production side, but the storytelling side. And I think that it helped me get my job there. That and having gone to NYU.
And can you talk about some of your responsibilities at Disney? And again, how they shape your experiences as a future writer?
I would say Disney had a huge influence on me as a writer for a variety of reasons. So I started there as an assistant to two development executives in direct-to-video. So they were doing sequels and developing original ideas for feature-length animated movies that would go straight to home video. So like Aladdin 2 was their inaugural film. And, Lion King 2 and Lion King 1.5 and a Beauty and the Beast Christmas and all these things were coming out of there. And at first I was just chopping wood and carrying water. I was carrying storyboards down the hall for people and setting up appointments. And they would come up with the story themselves, come up with an outline. They'd pitch it, get approval, and then they would look for a screenwriter to actually write the script. And so eventually, after much pushing and striving, I got a position as a junior executive there. And then my job was, you had what was called weekend read. So Friday afternoon, you would have a story meeting and everybody would bring in all the scripts, the sample scripts for potential writers. And we would sort them and people would take them and you'd go home with like 15 screenplays to read over the weekend. And then on Monday morning, you'd have another story meeting and you'd pass on the person or say this person might be good for this project. And then when you had a project, so you're also developing story ideas. And what I learned from my time at Disney is, there's a Disney way of telling a story, but they really taught me story structure in a way that I'd had a grasp on it before. And I'd taken screenwriting classes, so I knew what a 3-act structure looked like. I knew what the hero's journey was, but we actually had, I think Chris Vogler, who wrote The Writer's Journey, which is the writer's take on Joseph Campbell's hero's journey structure. He came in and spoke to the executives, so we got to have a class with him. You're constantly writing out story beats and learning how the guts of a story come together. And I had access to a lot of writers. We had a few staff writers and Flip Kobler and Cindy Marcus, who wrote a bunch of things for Disney. Cindy mentored me in a way she didn't realize. When she said to me, I said, "Why do you have a sofa in your office?" And she said, "Because sometimes you need to dream." And she told me I needed to trust my writing. And I trusted my writing so much eventually that I quit Disney because you couldn't write your own stuff at Disney. They owned everything you created. And so that was, again, like the powers that be. I couldn't tell my own stories, and my stories were different from what I was allowed to do. And so I left to write for kids. And years later, and several books later, I ran into Cindy Marcus, and I told her how much she had helped me. And she was stunned, but she was also like, "Yeah, I told you need to trust your writing." So it was pretty amazing.
And after you left Disney, you worked for 9 years at Bongo Comics, which Matt Groening, who's the creator of The Simpsons, helped co-found, and which was arguably best known for its Simpson comics. And while you were there, you had the opportunity to write comics, did you not?
I did. That's what got me into writing comics. I was at Disney and I was friends with people in other departments. And when I quit, actually the pit stop was I had a temp job for a year at a construction company. And I worked out of a triple wide trailer down at Los Angeles International Airport because we were refurbishing the new Universal hub, United Terminal hub. And I was there for a while, and that's where I started writing my first book on the backs of Post-its and things. And a friend of mine said, "Oh, my wife works at this comic book company, and they're looking for an office manager. You used to do that for Tim Burton. You should apply." And I did, and I got the job, and I was so glad because the people at the construction company were incredibly kind, wonderful people, Dinwiddie Construction, but I missed being around creatives. Creativity in construction is a very different animal than storytelling and artists. And so I moved over to Bongo, and that became a real family. And I think just about the same time I got the job, I sold my first book. So they knew I was a writer, and they're like, "If you'd ever want to try comics, try it." And so I did. And I used to write, The Simpsons ran as a Sunday strip in the London Times. And so I wrote a bunch of those. But yeah, it was great because I learned. They were patient with me, and the basic switches from writing for animation versus a comic. It's like you have a movement in this panel. A comic cannot move. Learn to break it down. Why is this visual? I knew all of the why is it visual and not just prose. I knew that from working at Disney. But getting your brain to slow down to choose the right frame to convey information took some time, and they gave it to me. And I've written for them off and on for years and have now just moved on to new comic projects outside of Bongo. So that's sort of exciting.
So as you were moving between these jobs, you mentioned that you were writing on the side. When did you begin to think seriously about the prospect of earning a living as a full-time writer?
I'm still considering the possibility of earning a living as a full-time writer. a writer was not a job when I was a kid. Books just existed. We didn't have the sort of access that people have today to their favorite authors. So it wasn't until like high school where my freshman year English teacher was like, we wrote a letter to the publisher of this book to ask the writer some questions. And she wrote back and we were like, what? It was like crossing dimensions and being like, we spoke to God today. So it seemed impossible. So I never really thought about it that way. I've been trying to write a novel since I was 10 years old, but with very, very limited success, as in none whatsoever. But, when I left Disney, I said, I'm leaving to write books for kids. And I was going to do that, but I didn't know enough about the industry to know if that was a job. So I always had a day job. I always assumed I would have a day job. And then my mom passed away. And life started looking up to me, and I thought, I loved where I worked at the comic book company, but it wasn't all that I was meant to do. And I felt like the real thing that popped in my head was, if it was bring your kid to work day, would you be proud? And I thought, yes, for the people, but not for my work, for what I was doing, which was really just maintaining the place, making sure the bills were paid and the lights were on. And so I told myself, I applied to a writing residency at Hedgebrook, which is this amazing retreat for women writers on Whidbey Island in Puget Sound. And it was sort of a Shangri-La for me because at the time the rules were you could only go once if you got accepted, and it had to be a minimum of 2 weeks. And I never had that kind of time because I only had 2 weeks of vacation total. But my mom died and I applied. And I said in my essay, if I get accepted, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to write full time. And I got accepted and I thought, oh my God, I have to quit my job. Which they would not have held me to. And I kept my job for several more months because my company was they're so supportive of me at Bongo. And they still are. I still see them. I'm still friends with people there. And we spend time together. And what I ended up doing is, because my mom had died, we sold our house and I had a little chunk of money. So my idea was to take a year off, rent an office somewhere, because my husband works from home and was like, you cannot be in the house with me. I can't work with you here. And so I rented a little office and spent the year writing. I got myself a comfortable chair for $100 at a charity store so that I could sleep and dream like Cindy Marcus told me to. And I queued up a lot of work. I wrote a lot of stuff. I worked on Orleans during that time and some things that didn't get published. But by the end of it, I was like, I really need a job. And then the Great Recession happened and I couldn't find a job. And I was struggling and I was like, this was dumb. This was the dumbest idea I'd ever had. And so I ended up being a full-time writer for 2 years. And then I finally found a job as another office manager position at a makeup special effects company. And I had like $17 in my bank account. And so I was like, sold, I'll take it. And I worked there for 4 years. And it was interesting. Like, I always had the most boring job in the most interesting places. And I learned a lot. I got to make, fake human intestines. And we made a lot of monsters and aliens and dead people for TV and movies. And it was really cool, but it wasn't a career, for me. And then I finally, a friend of mine who taught at Goddard College said, would you want to teach here? And I met her at Hedgebrook. And from the moment she told me she taught at Goddard College and they had a campus in Port Townsend, Washington, and one in Vermont, my dream was to teach at the Port Townsend campus. And so I get this call out of the blue years later, and she's like, they need someone at the Port Townsend campus. And I was like, what? Yes. And it was a temporary thing. It was just like, we need you just for this semester. And I said, yes. And I have been teaching there for 3 years. And they needed me. And I teach on the Vermont campus. That's my home campus. But so I teach at this low residency MFA creative writing program there. And a few months after my first residency, I was at AWP's conference. So the association, what is it? It's the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. And I was at a conference there on a couple of panels, and I was approached by a program director for the MFA in children's writing program at Hamline University. And they're like, we know you teach at Goddard. Do you want to teach with us too? And I was like, what? Yeah. So I was able to leave my job at the makeup effects company, which was slowing down because the TV show that we were doing was slowing down. And so now I guess it depends on the sort of writer you are. I guess I am making a living as a writer because I teach writing and I write. But, it's not sort of that, you still have that fantasy of like, you are a writer who wears a smoking jacket and you have an office in like a library that's like 12 feet, 20 feet tall with ladders, and all you do all day is write. Like, I haven't attained that yet, but it's on the list.
I want to talk about your books. World War II has served as the backdrop for two of your books, Flygirl, which is a work of fiction about a young African-American woman who passes as white in order to fly planes for the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP, and Who Were the Tuskegee Airmen, which is a work of nonfiction published just this year. Scholastic, I believe, is also publishing a graphic novel you wrote,
yes,
Pearl, about a Japanese-American girl whose family is caught in the attack on Pearl Harbor and who later volunteers to serve as a translator for the military.
No, that description is off.
Oh, is it?
Oh, that's fascinating. I was about to say you were amazing with your research, but I wonder where you found that because the description is off.
Okay.
Pearl is actually about a Japanese-American girl who is stuck in Japan visiting her family. She's got a sick great-grandmother when Pearl Harbor is bombed, and she is from Hawaii, so she has no idea what's happening but is stuck in Japan, which happened to a lot of Japanese Americans. Their family sent them back to learn Japanese, to go to school, all the things that you might do as a family of two cultures. And so people were stuck there during the war. And then she's conscripted by the Japanese army to intercept and translate English radio waves. So it's really more of a question of identity, citizenship, what it means to be a traitor or a patriot. It's not so much a voluntary thing as a compulsory thing,
What inspires you to write about that particular time period?
God, Sean, I wish I knew. Because all the stories have come to me differently. And I do think once you start going down the rabbit hole of research, you find all these other tunnels. Like, oh, you could go here or there. Flygirl came about because I heard a Radio Diaries documentary on my local NPR station on KPCC about the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. And that really, it struck me, it moved me, and it turned into this novel. And then I guess the Tuskegee Airmen book came about because I met the editor for the series, and I said, oh, have you done a book about the WASP? Have you done a book about the Tuskegee Airmen? And she was like, no, but we'd love a Tuskegee Airmen book, and you wrote Flygirl, how would you like to do it? So that happened. That was my most recent one. But Pearl came about because I was at Hedgebrook for a residency, and I met my friend Rana Reiko Rizzuto, who is the one who teaches at Goddard and got me, told me about the job at Goddard. She had written a beautiful memoir called Hiroshima in the Morning, and she had gone to Japan on a fellowship to interview bomb survivors. And while she was there, 9/11 happened here in the States, and she's a New Yorker. And her book got derailed. Her life got derailed, really. But this amazing thing happened. She's married, had kids, and her husband was still in New York with their boys and was like, come home. And she's like, I can't, because for the first time ever, the Hiroshima bomb survivors were opening up and telling stories they had never told, because they'd gotten used to sort of telling, this is my story, this sort of canned version of things. And when 9/11 happened, they were so shaken because they had hoped it would never happen again. They were so shaken that they started telling different stories. And she couldn't leave because she was like, this window is going to close, and it's never going to happen again. And she ended up writing this memoir about that time in her life that it's just stunning. But in it, there is an interview with this very sort of blowhard military guy, retired military, and he mentions the Monitor girls in Hiroshima. And it was amazing. Something happened in my head that it was like a drop of water spreading on a piece of colored paper, and like the color just blooms. This entire story just came to me, and just off of a couple of sentences. And so I wrote it down, I outlined it, and the next day at dinner, I said, this thing just happened. Can I tell this story? And she said, I'll give you my research, which is the most generous thing anyone has ever done. And she totally supported it. And it's funny, the book she was trying to write with that trip is called Shadow Child, and it just came out. It took like 10 years, but it just came out this year. Shadow Child, it's this beautiful sort of sweeping World War II and beyond epic story. So that was like a totally different point of entrance into World War II. But then I'm actually working on another novel that'll go to the copy editor in February, hopefully, called The Blossom and the Firefly. And I think it must have been somewhere doing my research on Pearl and just sort of noodling around. I do a lot of noodling around. I found this article about kamikaze pilots in Japan in World War II. And in this one town in Chiran, in southern Japan, junior high school girls were servants. They were maids to the kamikaze pilots. And one of their jobs was to line the runway on their final missions and wave goodbye, smiling. So that's my next book. And I told my agent that I need to stop writing about war. Because it's dark research. It's hard. It's very emotional. But just a few weeks ago, we had 11 people killed in a temple on the East Coast, and we had 2 people killed in a parking lot of a grocery store. And I thought, our greatest generation is passing on, and somebody needs to remember these stories and tell these stories to the next generation and the next, so that we never make the same mistakes again. And we are in grave danger of making those mistakes when we have a president who is calling himself a nationalist without perhaps knowing what that actually means. So I feel that I have a responsibility to let people know what that means, so that we can at least make an informed mistake if we're making a mistake. Instead of, the world is getting a lot more authoritarian and conservative and isolationist, and we know where that goes. So I think that every time I think I'm done with World War II, I suspect it's not done with me.
In many of your books, the locales in which you set your stories almost emerge as characters in their own right. And you're cognizant of that because you've talked in interviews you've given about the importance of setting stories and landscapes with a voice of their own. From a writer's perspective, why is that important?
Setting is a tool, and the city or the room, the landscape enhances your story. It would be a mistake to leave such a great piece of magic on the table when you're trying to construct this illusion. And I think that because the book I would say that is most true in, for me, is Orleans, because it is the story of the city. It's the people are part of it, but it is the story of a place. And that book was intentionally the story of a place because it was an homage to the New Orleans that I grew up knowing. My grandparents lived there. My mother was from there, and she was a Katrina evacuee. And it definitely rose out of that. But every place you go to has a color, a smell, a tone, and an atmosphere. And if you can conjure that in your writing, then your reader is there. And I think books are portals, and if you have a tool like that at your disposal to transport someone, you should use it.
In 3 of your novels, Sparrow, which is an absolutely beautiful book, and if people can get their hands on it, I strongly encourage them to read it, Flygirl and Orleans are all set in New Orleans, and you mentioned that you have familial connections to that city, but I wonder, what inspires you to write about it so frequently?
Have you ever been to New Orleans?
Yes, and your books capture it beautifully.
Thank you. It is, so there's a term, genius loci. some places have a spirit, or they are a sentient being in and of themselves. And I think New Orleans is one of those places. She is an eternal city in a way. She's had a lot of different cultures settle there, influence her, and she has never let go of any of them. So it's one of the most layered places in the United States, I think, and has this deep, deep, deep history. And there's just so many stories there to tell. But, each of those books, like Flygirl, I knew the South from my time there and my family connection, my mother's stories. So it made sense for me to use a place that I knew. They always say, write what you know. And I don't always agree with that, because I think you should write what interests you. But when it's something that you know and it interests you, like, that's gold. Knowing that I could conjure the way it tastes and sounds and smells. And Orleans is sort of a prayer for the city. It's just, it was so devastated by that storm and has changed completely. And in my mind, I mean, there's things, like I said, it never lets go of. So it's always going to have that sense of a European city and an American state. And that's not going to change. But these layers have obscured the city as I knew it. I can still find it there, definitely. It was many years after my mom died. It was years before I went back to New Orleans. And I actually went back for a school visit for Orleans in, I guess, where was I? I guess it was in Slidell, outside of the city. And the librarian there had chosen Orleans because she had students who had been toddlers when the storm hit. And so they knew about it, and their families had been upset by it, but they didn't really know what it was. And so she used Orleans as a way of teaching them and did some amazing things with the book. They built the world in Minecraft. They turned it into a game. You were given Halloween candy, and you had to find a way out of the city, save a baby, like in the book. And so I went down to the city and saw my mom's old house and visited this amazing exhibit about the storm and about the science behind the environmental science of protecting the wetlands. And it really felt like home. I don't know that I would ever live there, but I felt recognized by the city, and that I was recognizing the city too. And so, I don't know, maybe that's just one of my ghosts that haunts me.
I think Orleans is remarkably prescient in many ways. For people listening to the podcast who haven't read it, the story takes place in a future at a time when multiple hurricanes, each more severe than the last, have ravaged the Gulf Coast region, leading the U.S. government to abandon the people who live there. And in doing so, they literally build a wall that holds the people in that region in. And wow, reading that novel in this particular time and in this particular socio-political climate is very powerful.
Thank you. It's, I think for speculative fiction, it's an extrapolation of our world. And one of the things, it's funny, there's a series of storms, of hurricanes that battered the Gulf Coast in the beginning of the book. And I actually had to change some of the storm names because while I was writing the book, they were hitting. And so we were like, that's awkward. Maybe we should change this. Because there is a list of hurricane names. So I started making up names instead of using the official list because we're just having more and more storms. But the wall, I remember my freshman year of college at NYU, everybody had to take Psych 101. And in that class, I remember reading in my Intro to Psych book that the Berlin Wall was an external manifestation of schizophrenia in our culture, our society, the planet, that the planet was fractured. And when I was in college, the wall came down. And I remember watching it come down on TV and crying because I never thought it would happen in my lifetime. And so anytime I want to think of what's damaging, there's a wall. And in this case, it was meant to be a protective wall, right? Some walls can be good. They hold dangerous things at bay, or they, keep something contained, or they keep you safe, right? Good fences make good neighbors. but then they're the ones that hide something and deny something. And this was meant to be protective, a quarantine wall in Orleans. But I think often things that start off one way can change for the worse. Sometimes for the better, but usually it's for the worse.
I want to build on that. In the past decade, I've noticed there's been a movement in young adult literature, especially YA speculative fiction, towards stories about characters who rise above their circumstances as a result of their own merits. Your books interest me in that they offer another perspective. Rather than celebrate independence, they emphasize interdependence and the strength that people find when they come together as a collective. And I think that sentiment is evident, for example, in Flygirl, when the protagonist Ida May quotes from the novel Three Musketeers and says, "All for one and one for all." To what do you attribute your interest in exploring that theme of interdependence in your books?
Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. I think it all goes back to that deep-seated need for, a crew of my own. But also, I think it's an elusive thing. It's hard to find. I learned in film school, we had these little crews of 3 or 4 people, and it didn't always work out. I would do my best for others, and I suppose everybody was doing their best, but like my final film was a disaster because my camera person focused the camera with her glasses on and then shot the film with her glasses off. And so everything, a third of the movie was out of focus. And I didn't know this until I was in the editing room. And so I had this problem. I mean, I guess it started in high school with people who, team projects where somebody would drop the ball or not do the work, and then you're left pulling an all-nighter. And I find it frustrating, and I feel like the world would be such a better place if we could all pull in the same direction. Think of what we could achieve. And nobody does it alone. I definitely stand on the shoulders of my parents and their parents and the people that came before them. There's a line in Amistad that is something like Amistad, the movie about the revolt on the slave ship. And I can't remember what it was, but it was something like, at this moment, I am my ancestors' entire reason for being. And that's powerful to me, that you're an expression of hope across generations. And if you can team up with other people that have that same kind of thrust behind them, like you could reach the stars. And so finding your tribe, which is literal in Orleans and figurative in my other books, I think is very important. And I think that Orleans, it's funny, I wanted Orleans to be a trilogy. And the marketplace didn't agree, but I've always felt that it's left undone because the entire point, it was going to be a reunification. She quotes Lincoln that, a house divided cannot stand in the first book, and by the end it was supposed to be what the future could be, just to be able to give, once again, underscore that, like, we're in divisive times right now. We're very fractured, and what it's doing is destroying what was always wonderful about America. America's always had its problems. There's no hiding that. But we also had this dream that it seems like we all have the same dream now, but we're calling it something different. And somehow one of us can't have a dream without the other one losing the dream. And that's a problem.
I'd like to talk for a minute about Pasadena,
Mm-hmm.
which is your latest prose novel. And it strikes me as being rather unique in the field of young adult fiction in that it's a noir story.
Mm.
And again, for listeners who haven't read the novel, Pasadena follows a young woman who's struggling to understand what led to the death of her best friend, who presumably committed suicide. In keeping with the spirit of noir fiction, the story is very dark, very gritty, and it revolves around characters who have very dark demons. What inspired you to write a noir story for young readers?
My husband is a film noir fan. And one night he was watching a movie, and I sat down next to him and I said, gee, I wonder if I could write a noir. And he goes, you think? And I said, Sure. So I'm going to write a noir. And it was my lunchtime project. I had a yellow legal pad, and every day I would write 3 pages at lunch, longhand. And I wrote it first person, and it was just like, what would I do next? What would I do next? And my setup was think of the most damaged people I knew and, see what I could spin from that, because my husband came to me the next day and was like, you got to understand, Sherri, there's no heroes in noir. Everybody's damaged. Everybody has a problem. And I was like, I know. I went to film school and I studied noir and I watched noir with my mom because she was a film buff. It wasn't my arena, really. I liked stylistically how film noir looks with the, harsh shadows and silhouettes and things. But that's what I did. I just sort of went down that rabbit hole, found my character right away, and I knew, who had died, and just chased it down. And it was wonderfully freeing. And when you talk about using a place as a character, Pasadena, which is a city that's about, 15 miles east of me, is this beautiful old city that I've always enjoyed. It's a very pretty place. It's where the Tournament of Roses parade is on New Year's Day. And so it's the City of Roses. I went, when my husband turned 40, we had this big birthday party and we showed a film noir. We showed The Big Sleep. And I had a friend make these little statuettes of my husband that we painted matte black like the Maltese Falcon. And he lived in a pool house in Pasadena. And I went to go talk to him. And it's the street that Maggie's parents live on. It was creepy. There are these big old mansions that have seen better days, but are still striking, like old women sort of holding themselves together and still putting on the pearls and the lipstick every day, and these giant palm trees. And there was this creepy atmosphere, that sense of being watched, because there were suspicious people twitching the old curtains and looking out. And I knocked on his door and I said, this is gothic and creepy. And he was like, yes, it totally is. So I always thought I want to use that one day. So that became the setting. And someone asked me, why did you use Pasadena? Why wouldn't you set it in New Orleans or in Chicago, where you're from? And, if I had all the time in the world, I would love to tell the same story in both of those cities, because they'd be totally different because of the city, but equally as gothic and creepy, particularly in the South.
While I was preparing for our conversation, I came across a review of Pasadena in Kirkus Review, which concluded by pointing out that while readers learn that Jude, the story's protagonist, is not particularly affluent, and I'm going to quote the review here, the absence of other markers implies that she's white.
Uh-huh. I'm so glad you pointed that out.
I'm curious to know your thoughts about that.
This is what Nissi Shawl and Cynthia Ward, in their writing the other book, call the unmarked state. There is an assumption that absent any identifiers, the character must be the ethnicity, the gender of the dominant culture in which the story is set. So if any book you read, a man walks into a room, he's obviously a white man, but if it's going to be a person of color, then they will tell you, oh, and then a person of color also walked in. And so I've seen writers flip it, where if they're telling a story that's predominantly in an African-American neighborhood, then the identifiers are if a white person comes in, because they are not the dominant culture in that space. Pasadena, I originally wrote this book. Jude didn't even have a name. I wanted her to be the camera. I wanted her to be completely unmarked so that the reader could identify and explore this mystery through her without having to see her. And so that was my original plan. So I don't describe her, and it's an ethnically diverse group of friends. And I do call out different ethnicities and things. My high school group of friends was also really diverse. And I hesitated there, should I specifically say this person's Korean or this person is that, or shouldn't I? And I decided to do it just because I think there's a lack of representation. So I was going to deliberately say, yes, this person's Korean. Deal with it, just put it out there. but I didn't want to do it for her. And I had an image in my head of how you might describe her or what she might be, but I deliberately didn't put it in there. She has a name because as I wrote, I started realizing people were saying her name and I was just leaving a blank space. And I was like, okay, people want to address her by name, so let me come up with a name for her. But I read that review and I was entertained, surprised, and annoyed all at the same time, I think, because it was the reviewer making the choice for the reader. And that bothered me. Richard Peck wrote a book called The Most Beautiful Girl in the World. And I haven't read the book, but I heard him speak about it. And he said that he describes the girl with everything but a physical description. And the story is from the point of view of like a friend of hers or something. So you never see her. And he said he did it deliberately so that the reader could project their image of the most beautiful girl in the world onto her. And then the publisher gave it a photo cover of a blonde girl. And he was angry because it was somebody's assumption of what beauty was now being forced on the reader. And I've always remembered that. So that was sort of in my mind with Jude.
I'm curious, as a writer of color, do you experience pressure to tell particular kinds of stories or to address social topics in your books?
Yes and no. I am really lucky in that I'm genre fluid and I can jump around and tell a bunch of different types of genre stories. And no one yet has, at least my main publishers have not been like, this has to be about a Black person, or how do you feel about Black Lives Matter? Nobody has done that to me yet, except for a book packager once approached me years and years ago, and they were like, we have a story idea. We'd like you to develop it into a trilogy. And so I was like, okay, I'll do that. And I wrote outlines for these 3 novels. And the note I got back, I had a phone call with them, and they were like, oh, she's not Black. And I was like, no, did you want her to be Black? You didn't say that. And the story was like this girl being dragged around by her free-spirited mother, living in communes and doing things. And they were like, well, why isn't she Black? And I was like, well, hey, you didn't tell me she needed to be. But I said, oh, because a Black woman wouldn't do that. And I was joking, but they got very uncomfortable. They were like, and I was like, yeah, no, Black women are sensible and they don't run around communes. And they were very apologetic. And I was like, no, it's because you didn't ask for that. It will change the story because there would be different reasons and a different level of privilege implied for an African-American woman to be doing these things. And so I revised it. And then it became actually sort of interesting because there was this sort of deeper family history, and it had to bring in the grandparents and a certain level of disappointment because these grandparents had elevated their family to a certain financial status, and she was squandering it by being, hippy-dippy free spirit. And then they were just like, they couldn't wrap their heads around it and were interfering in the storytelling. They said, oh, we'll help. And I wrote them some sample chapters and they wrote back. They had added things and changed things in a voice that was not the voice of the piece. And so ultimately I was like, I wouldn't put my name on this because it was literally like, it's a black and white movie. And then suddenly there's a scene that's all in green. For no reason. And then back to black and white, I was like, okay, I actually don't understand what we're doing here. So I ended up backing out of the project. But that was the one time. That and then I've had sort of the battle of the book covers. The cover for Orleans, the main character is on the cover, and she is a brown-skinned girl. But the first cover I got, she was blonde with a ponytail, and she looked like an aerobics instructor on a hike through ruins. She had these cute little short shorts with stitching on the back and a blonde ponytail and a backpack and a jaunty pose. And I was like, who's that? What's she doing in the story? So they cut off the ponytail and gave her a braid texture and darkened the skin and darkened up the shorts. And so you can still see, it's a great, great cover. You can still, if you know what it looked like before, see hints of the aerobics instructor.
I'm glad that you shared both of those stories because as I was preparing for our conversation, I came across a video interview in which you stated that while diversity in young adult literature is incredibly important, simply presenting more racially or ethnically diverse characters and stories isn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
And you went on to suggest that there's a need for books that represent, I'm going to quote you here, different walks of life. Could you say more about that?
Sure. A term that I didn't know at the time of that interview, someone commented on another book. They called it brownwashing, when you just color in the characters, but you're not filling in their cultural perspective. That's another term from that writing the other book, the parallax view, and how someone's references are different based on their culture. And so you can't make the broad assumption that everybody approaches a situation the same way. I think we're seeing it a lot now with like this Me Too movement, that apparently there are a lot of men who are good men who had no idea that women were harassed so frequently, or that you learn to hold your keys a certain way so you can fend off an attacker if you're walking to your car alone at night. And so if you had a man writing a woman who goes out for midnight jogs because it helps her think, no woman would ever do that unless she was packing heat, had a giant dog with her, or it was an estate that with security, like she knew she was going to be safe, or she was, a serial killer looking for trouble, which is also kind of a cool character, but who knows, but it's just sort of that understanding of whose shoes you're actually walking in. And there is I'd say the dominant paradigm in YA literature has always been, and it's changing, but has often been middle to upper middle to wealthy white kids, educated, they're in school or they have learned things somewhere. We don't get a lot of stories about kids below the poverty line. If you do, it is that is the story, rather than that's just a fact of life in their world. You do, I think more recently, as more YA writers are feeling comfortable talking about their own variety and their own traumas and their own experiences, you're getting a lot more stories about gender differences, sexual preference differences, and religion, faith, things like that. I did an interview with Finding Wonderland. It's this great YA blog for Flygirl. And I had asked the question, where in your life have you passed pretending to be something that you are not? Because Ida Mae Jones, the protagonist, is a Black girl, light-skinned, passing for white. And nobody commented on the interview for days and days. And I thought that I had just sort of broken their blog, and I was very sorry. And then people started posting. And it was amazing how many people, there were people who lived in the Bible Belt but were from New York, and they pretended to be religious so they wouldn't have to be judged for being atheist. There were people who, a girl who studied Spanish in high school, so she pretended to be Spanish because people questioned why she'd be studying it if she was not actually Latina. And just all these sort of amazing things. I mean, people pretend to have money when they go into a store that they immediately realize they can't afford to be in because they don't want to be looked down on, or people pretend to not have money because they don't want to be taken advantage of. Everybody at some point has pretended to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, even if briefly, for a variety of reasons, for safety, for social, whatever, credit, all sorts of things. And it was interesting watching these stories come out and people who hadn't even thought they were passing. So, books are a great place to start sharing these honest stories. And what you'll end up with is people writing in and telling you that they thought they were alone. And knowing that they're not alone is all part of building that bridge crew, that it makes them feel a part of something bigger.
You're currently working on a monthly comic book for Dark Horse that you alluded to toward the beginning of our conversation that builds on the story world that James Cameron created in his film Avatar. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I don't know how much of it I can talk about at this point,
okay.
But it's true. Like, I did a short story for them for a free comic book day. I guess that was last year. And what we have coming out in January will be a 6-issue arc called Tsute's Path. So if you're familiar with James Cameron's Avatar, the original movie, it's a story of this guy, Jake Sully, who is a former Marine, paralyzed from the waist down, and his twin brother is a scientist who has this avatar body that he can upload his consciousness into, and he's getting ready to set sail to this distant planet, Pandora, where he's going to be a scientist there, but the brother is killed in a mugging. And because they're identical twins, the company approaches Jake and says, we want you to do it instead. And he does, and he gets to inhabit this big blue strong body with legs that work, and then is set to infiltrate the native population, the Na'vi, on this planet. And so that story, there is Jake, there are several Na'vi characters that he becomes involved with, Neytiri, and Neytiri's intended future husband, Tsute. And so Tsute is an antagonist for him. And, poor Tsute gets the short end of the stick in that story, ultimately, because Jake is the hero. And so what I have been given is the opportunity to tell that story from his point of view. And so you'll get to see things, there's overlap, and then there's things that you haven't seen. And it was amazing. It was an amazing way to it's telling the stories from all these different perspectives and paths. The parallax view is a completely different thing from the point of view of the native as opposed to the outsider coming in.
Sherri, thank you so much for taking time to talk with me and to share your experiences as a writer.
Absolutely. This was fantastic, and you're a good person to talk to, Sean.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Storyteller's Thread podcast. If you like what you heard, please take a moment to rate the show on iTunes or tell a friend about it. In the meantime, wherever you're joining us from, have a happy holiday. I hope you're able to enjoy time with family and loved ones. And remember, if there's an upside to winter, it's that you have a built-in excuse to stay inside where it's warm and lose yourself in a good book. I look forward to seeing you back here in the new year when we'll continue to celebrate the craft of storytelling. Until then, happy holidays.